Hi, my name is Alfred, and the title of this post is Windows Role-Based Access Control with Attributes and Authorization Manager. So I'm going to start by presenting the problem. Often the functionality of an application is distributed into application roles, and this allows a user or user groups to be assigned to these roles so that access to the application's functionality can be controlled in a similar manner that you might find in which an administrator can control which users can log on to which computers within a company, only at the application level. This infrastructure is often implemented in a proprietary manner within an application's code base. Some companies might they have an in-house development department. They might just have their own modules already set up for that they use across the enterprise. So Microsoft said, okay, let's factor out this common functionality. Much like with the common application patterns the enterprise library aims to provide. First thing actually I'll show you is Authorization Manager. This is what it looks like. I've chosen to keep the settings in an XML file, so you can also use, like for example, if we want to set up a new store here, we can set it up in Microsoft SQL Server or Active Directory, but I chose just an XML file. I usually don't put anything in this first folder here. It's an application, so you can add applications. I set up a group first of all, named it the administrator, added my user here to it. The next thing is the definition, so this is where most of the stuff happens. I have a role definition here. I called it administrator as well. What this does is it groups the tasks that we have defined. All of the tasks that I do have defined, I have assigned to this one role. When your code runs, an attempt to call a procedure is made, then what you can do is you can go and you can query Authorization Manager and say, here's the operation, here's the user context, their identity, do they have access to run this code? So within each task definition, you group the operations, basically the functionality of your application, into these tasks. Here are the operations that I consider to be what I term securable. Some operations are just so low level that it doesn't really make a lot of sense to have security at that level, because you're going to want it at a higher level anyway. Then again, there are too many operations in the sample application I have here. I have them grouped into these tasks. I believe the one that has the most operations is probably the process management one. I'm not really going to try to go into the code as far as what it actually does or even the purpose of the application. You have these procedures. You can see that each one is assigned an operation number. This is when you query Authorization Manager, it expects you to be able to give it that number. And then finally we have a role assignment. So we come here and for example, you could assign users from Active Directory or from Authorization Manager. So what that means is I could say I want to assign something to the administrator role. So you come here and you assign users and you can select which groups. And we already created the administrator one, so I could just select this and click OK. Or we can come and pick users from Active Directory, but I chose to do it from role that I defined within Authorization Manager. So anyway, that's how you kind of set it up. I mean, it takes some time, but not too much time, and then you save your XML file off somewhere. And of course, it's not the safest, it's not the most secure way to do it. Active Directory would probably be the most, or SQL Server would be the most secure, but this way it's just easier for me to set up as a demonstration. So let's get rid of that. A little bit about the application. This is set up in a PRISM MVVM architecture. And if you don't know anything about that, basically, I will have a video, probably reference that. But basically, just think about it in three different tiers. You got your code that runs, you have your view, and then in the middle you have some logic in between that kind of factors out your main code, and it presents that functionality to the presentation layer in a way that pertains more closely to what the presentation layer wants to achieve. And what's nice about this right now is that some validation happens on startup. The user interface is actually tied to this infrastructure, in that if you're not authorized to run this code, then the actual functionality in the user interface will actually be disabled. And you can do whatever you want. You can actually make it look different. You can do whatever you want. But this happens at startup actually. And then it actually happens every time you want to do something. So it's not most efficient if you have calls from the view to your operations many times a second. That's not going to be efficient. You're going to want to do some validation, some authorization, and then cache that. So anyway, let's actually just get into this thing. I'm gonna start this up and just see what happens. Okay. All right. We're on startup. Let's let that fly. This architecture requires a lot of kind of like a lot of startup code, more than what you would expect, I suppose. Okay, so actually, we're currently, well, I'm using also the MEF library, where you can basically import other pieces of code, and it's basically a dependency injection container. So right now it's trying to satisfy actually the guard dog class, which is actually incorporated into the base class, probably the main base class that I use for my view models. And so because that's where I want that validation to occur prior to the procedure actually running in the bottom layer, I want it to be in the second tier in the view model to say, well, first of all, before we run this code, does this user even have permission to run it? And so because this is initialized this is imported into the base class of every view model, basically it needs to be satisfied at this point. But just once actually. Well, it depends, it's an option, but in this case it's just once. It's a single instance that's shared among the view model classes. And I call it guard dog, is just to make it extremely obvious. It's kind of my style, I guess. If this looks familiar, this is the XML structure that we actually created, and this path is going to be resolved to my documents. It's currently where I have it located. Okay, so let's just run through this, and actually I want to show you what type of infrastructure I have in place to assist this type of scenario. So we pass in the Windows identity, which is going to be mine, of course. And then actually, if we look at this application role type enumeration, we actually mimic those tasks right here. And how do I use that? Well, on an operation, so let's just go to one of these classes. Let's look at one of these methods. I have a securable attribute, and this create method right here is in the authorization manager with the value of 1 as the way that it kind of ties to that. And so this securable attribute is used by this guard dog class. Well, first we get the values out of that enum. So let's run through this. And so, for example, let's look and let's see what we have in the defined roles. So as you can see, I have this app role class, which basically is just one of the enumeration types, as well as securable. And what a securable actually is it's going to end up actually being a method info object. So we're using reflection a lot in this as well. And so it's basically initializing its securables. Here we are going to initialize the shell, and what that does is once the shell starts up in the PRISM architecture, it says, okay, what are all my other views? Okay, so here we are in the can remove procedure in the process configuration view model. So because this is directly tied to a visual element, basically there's a commanding infrastructure involved where that element says, I have a command associated with myself. I'm going to basically validate that this command can run for this user. So that's a part of PRISM that you get with the delegate command. we're calling this can remove procedure. So can we even call this thing to begin with? Not can we do it, but can we actually just call the code that does that? And if you notice, we see what happens here. But this is basically the main piece of this code. We call can execute as a more of a generic method that they all end up calling, and this method helper function basically will take in the class where this operation actually is defined, and then the name of that operation. It's a helper method to return a method info object, and that gets passed into can execute. And if we go look at that guy, this is, like I said before, on the base class for the view models. And I'm sorry about all this extra code, don't really worry about it. Once we get into here, let's walk through this. Let me actually get my debug. Okay. And now what we're doing is we're getting the custom attributes off of that method info object, and for each one we're basically saying, okay, what is the type of that attribute? Because I don't know if you noticed before, but we had a validatable attribute. We also had a securable attribute. So we go and we check and we say, okay, which one is it? In this case it's securable. And now look what we're calling. We're calling the guard dog is authorized. And then we let it go. If we say true, it'll let that person run that procedure, or the command will say yes, the person can interact with this visual element. So it'll be either enabled or disabled. So I like that a lot. I really like that setup. Otherwise it'll return false. So what we pass into is authorized is that method info object. So here we are in the guard dog, and we are going to try and break inside of the is authorized method. So we're going to get that method info object passed into us. Let's let that go. Okay, and now we have our defined roles. So let's take a look at those once again. Notice, for example, our process management. It actually has associated with it the method info object references for the operations that we saw defined in authorization manager. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. It basically says, okay, well, I know what role it belongs to, what securables belong to that role, and then it goes out and it actually queries the authorization manager and says, okay, well, does this user have access? And that's pretty much the whole thing. I mean, that's the whole thing. So here we go again, right? We have our view. These elements are bound to these commands which call can execute operations that basically go out and say you can or you cannot execute this. And you can have UI logic, you can have other business logic involved, but in this case we have included this authorization logic, this scenario where we call it from within a can execute. We call the is authorized from within the guard dog, which we have an instance shared across all the view models. And then this is basically it. I mean, it's really quite simple. And then all you need to do if you want a secure operation is to decorate it. That's pretty much all you have to do. Decorate it with that attribute, because the guard dog, if you notice up here, actually goes and gets the types of all the types that you have for that assembly. So it knows what all your operations are. It goes and it reads the attributes off of your operations. So let's go ahead and let's just run this. And here we are. We have the operation number 6. We have the app role type, and it's going to tell me whether or not I have access to do that or not. In this case, yep, I will. So it's going to return true, and then the procedure will then go ahead and be called, because the can execute will return true. And sorry about this pathetic looking interface, but anyway, thanks for watching.